This is a Dark Magazine podcast and I'm your host, Nalini Haynes.
Thank you very much for coming here to Antipodes Bookstore today. My name's Andrea Rowe. I'm a local author and the founder of Peninsula Writers Club and a few other things, and I'm our host for today in conversation with Wendy. Welcome to Antipodes Bookstore. If you haven't been here before, it's our wonderful bookstore in the heart of the community of Sorrento. Where would we be without our bookstores in our communities? And we really would like to thank Jane, who will give you a wave, who's up the back busy selling books, and Lily, who's with her as well, for hosting us today and enabling Wendy to come in and have such a great celebration as well. At the end of today, books are available for sale and for signing as well, and it's a great way to support our local bookstores and keep them in our community as well. Before I start, I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land where we gather today, the Bunurong people, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and the fact that they are the original story keepers of our community as well. We have, if you haven't been to a launch before, we have some questions we're going to ask Wendy to learn a little bit more about the process of writing the book and also a little bit more about the story, so that after today, when you go home, if you're taking the book home with you, you can have a little bit of an insight into the book and the making of the book as well. But without further ado, I would love to introduce you to the woman of the hour, Wendy Orr, who is a vibrant voice in Australian children's literature, with a string of national and international awards, including the Prime Minister's Award for Children's Literature and the CBCA Book of the Year. Wendy's written over 40 books. That's an incredible innings. And she's been published in 27 different languages. Her books include the infamous Nim's Island, which so many of us love, the first Australian children's book to become a Hollywood feature film, which is quite a feat as well. Wendy believes that every child deserves to find the books that fuel their passion for stories and encourage empathy and connection and empower them for the future. And we're especially thrilled today to celebrate this new book, which we hope will fuel passions for stories with little children as well. Wendy's also a Mornington Peninsula resident. We're very pleased to have her living in our community. And her latest book, Honey and the Valley of Horses, grew out of lockdown thoughts. Remember those times? And a lifelong love of horses. It's a warm and wonderful story of joy, resilience, sustainability as well, and the importance of reaching out for help when we need it, which I'm sure is an important message that we can all take away from today. And there's also a touch of otherworld fantasy as well. So there's some wonderful otherworld vibes to this book. I do need to share with you, though, that Books and Publishing, which is kind of the trade mag of which we all willingly, quickly look at and then look away to see how our books are reviewed, called it a narrative by a master storyteller, a magical story that reads like a classic in all the best ways, which I absolutely agree with. So it's a joy that we gather today, Wendy, to welcome you. And thank you everyone who's come from far and wide as well. And thank you for sharing this open-hearted story with us. Can you share with us a little bit, though, of how the story of Honey and the Valley of the Horses came to you in the first place?
I always feel the quick answer is actually I have no idea. But I promised Andrea I wouldn't be that mean to her. So I actually heard the first line in my head quite a few years ago. In the mountains there was a valley, and in the valley were the horses. So I knew there was going to be a story for that line, but I really didn't know what it was, and it took several years to find it. And then I think it really grew out of the end of that first year of lockdown, when we started opening up a bit and we were all scared. And we were scared of so many things. We were scared of rules, we were scared of being caught out, and we were scared of the disease, but we were actually just scared of going out and meeting people again. And some of you guys are old enough that you had actually already started school, and then you had to not go to school. And that was really hard as people started going back to school. So you guys hadn't started yet, so it'll be good when you go. But it worried me to see kids so afraid of going out into the world. Because even though there's scary things in the world, there's scary things everywhere. We have to be brave and face them. And so I think this really it started me thinking. And then perhaps because my son and his wife and the baby was about 7 months, and the little girl about 2 and a bit, they moved in with us for most of that first year of lockdown. And then at New Year's Day, 2021, they moved out. And then, of course, we went back into lockdown. So now we not only couldn't see our daughter and her children who live up in Eltham, or the ones who'd lived with us for this whole year. And at the same time, the borders were closed. I knew I might never see my parents in Canada again. So there were a lot of emotions. But what I don't know is how that got combined with the horses, except that it was obvious it belonged to that line. And so then the horses started.
So in such a turbulent time, did you find it a comfort then to retreat to writing and to retreat into this story and write it as well?
It was, this story was really a lifesaver for me. In that second year of lockdown, and then both my parents actually died during the writing of the book, and we had a mini tornado that wiped out our bush and part of our house, and I ended up sick several times, and every time I kind of lurched from one disaster to another. In that little lull, I went back to the book. It's probably why it took 2.5 years to write. And it just gave me so much joy. And it was really, we talk about escaping into books, and it was really a lesson to me that, I really believe what I say. I've forgotten that. It really does bring me joy. And it was just, that's what books should do for us. Stories trap us, whether we're writing them or reading them. Stories just gather us up and they take us to another world. And sometimes that's fantastic.
Well, someone that did bring us joy in the story is the character of Honey. She's sort of fiercely curious, very outdoorsy. She lives in different circumstances than what so many children we know would live. And she has a very different lifestyle. Could you tell us a little bit about Honey and how you came to find her in the story as well?
Well, again, the answer is I don't know. But I think what happens for me is I have an idea of the character. But basically, it starts really basic. I know she's 11. I know that she's lived in this unusual situation where they are actually living in this beautiful place, but they can't get out of it. So nothing goes in or out. And then I guess she just comes from parts of me, parts of my childhood and parts of me that's still here, and gradually grows. And then at some point you think of what's sort of logical, but for me a lot of it is kind of instinctive of feeling who this character needs to be. And of course a lot of rewriting. Characters come from many, many drafts. They don't usually start out as fully formed as they end up on the page.
Look, the other premise of the story is we have a family that flees from lockdown times or flees from a kind of pandemic era of time, and they live in a converted ice cream van. I know that because I'm wearing ice cream socks. They live in this lovely converted ice cream van with grandma, mum and dad, Honey, and her little brother Rumi. And they find themselves sort of crossing this magical bridge into an enchanted land that then they can't leave from. As someone who lived in a camper trailer with my children for 9 months and then lived on the road with my family in our station wagon for 2 years as a kid and does a lot of sailing with my family, I am sometimes triggered when I think about tight places with your family, but also I feel very nostalgic for it because there is a time when you have to be a little bit more self-sufficient and everything has its place. And I love how when you wrote this fantastic ice cream van, which is a really cool place to live anyway, that everything had these kind of little nooks and systems and would service the family so well. Did you love writing that as a place to live and to retreat in as well?
Oh, absolutely. And we never actually, when I was a kid, and certainly as an adult, we never actually spent those kind of extended periods. But when I was a kid, we sailed a lot with my dad, and we built our first boat in the living room in Colorado, which is a very, very long way from any ocean. And then we trailered it to Toronto. And but so much of that was about, we used to get paid 20 cents an hour for sanding guardrails and for sanding little bits that would, keep things in so that when the boat heeled over, things wouldn't fall out of the cupboards. And so it was really a part of my childhood. My parents actually really, I sometimes think they actually enjoyed preparing their vans and boats over the years more than they enjoyed the trips because they spent years designing, fantastic little ways to keep things in and the best beds for the dogs. And until they actually converted a little fishing boat, it was called a tug, but it was a little kind of fishing boat, because they did give up sailing when they were 80, but they converted this one into a sort of pleasure craft, and that was their major project for when they were 80.
Well, it's fantastic. I know that you really enjoy reading about the joys of living in an ice cream van, including a fantastic scene where the children, of course, have never eaten ice cream. Well, one of them has, but can't really recall because they live in this enchanted valley for 7 years. So the little one, Rumi, was a baby when they went in, and where we meet them 7 years into living in this place. So it's kind of quite funny in that there's this temptation for little children there, but they can't even try a lick of ice cream. Can we talk about the valley? Because it's a beautiful place, and one thing you do right so well is to sort of imagine land and the scenery. You all of the books that I've read of yours, you certainly set us up so well with exploring scenery. Can you tell us a little bit about where you took some inspiration from the valley and what it offers this family as well?
Well, I do know more about where I get my environments from than I do about how the characters grow. And often when I first hear that first line, it's not the environment that it ends up. But so at first, because it was a kind of a fairy tale-ish line, I think I imagined a sort of like Grimm's fairy tale, northern dark forest. And that would just be totally impractical. You could not actually survive if you went out for like a 3-month camping trip and lived there for 7 years. So you don't have even proper axes and things like that. You wouldn't survive. So I thought about it for a while, and then I just suddenly remembered many, many years ago. And I think I'd written Nim's Island, and I think the film was in production, but it hadn't been released. And my husband and I went to a wedding in Maleny in Queensland, and we went for the most magical walk through a rainforest there. And it was before mobile phone cameras. And I'd actually forgotten my camera, and it was good because I really paid attention. And this place just seemed so magical, like the really thick vines that you can swing on. And by the way, National Geographic will tell you cannot swing on a vine because they grow from the ground.
Did you test that?
Yeah. Well, I actually tested it by going on to YouTube, where kids were doing their own videos of this is how you swing on a vine. Because, yes, they grow from the ground and they grow up the tree and then they loop over a big branch. And, well, I mean, around here we have the wild clematis one, and I mean, that really trips you. It goes all over the place. I'm sure you could swing on a big enough one. And I saw another video of a girl, and she was actually, while she was talking, she was just swinging on this vine that had looped into a swing. So, National Geographic doesn't know anything. I meant to say everything. They know a lot, and I've used National Geographic through my writing life so much. This one I disagree with. I'm just going to say, Bryony, there are chairs inside.
I'm okay.
Okay, okay. There's important things we have to worry about, such as people who are going to have babies very shortly. Yes, so I use that, and of course, once you go online, as well as remembering just different bits that you've been to, we also went to Mount Tambourine and the filming of Rescue on Return to Nims Island. And that was, again, just such a beautiful place. But of course, they have the advantage, it's tropical. You can live there without such preparation. There are tropical foods. But the family's not Indigenous. The grandmother was a gardener, but, they don't have huge knowledge of Indigenous plants and things. Their lives would have been better if they had. There's not that great message in the book, but it's something I really think about, that if they had known more about Indigenous plants that they had maybe used in their own gardens, it would have been easier for them. So, but what I do is just, I then Google, I found the state park in Mullaney, and I just went through all their animals, birds, native fruits, and then especially after this the mushroom poisoning incident lately, I actually was very careful. I did not name the berries because some of them I think are quite difficult to tell whether you're eating the edible purple berry or the ones that will make you vomit. So but that's how I sort of create it. And then I tweak things, but I try and use all the actual plants and animals, and then, throw in a few extra hot springs and things, but all feasible.
I had a vision of Wendy Orr swinging through the vines in the bush outside her house, and then serving up bowls of berries for her husband Tom to try during research. But it's good to know things are a little bit more safe and done on YouTube instead. So, but it does go to show that authors spend a lot of time researching and considering, just a throwaway comment, can actually sort of have, there can be repercussions. So a lot of authors spend a lot of time disappearing down the rabbit hole of research, but to build their knowledge as well, which is a really important thing for aspiring authors to keep in mind as well. I do want to talk about, though, your mention of the families foraging and food, because the biggest takeaway from the book is the messages of self-sufficiency and recycling and living off-grid and adapting to sort of live a little bit more in tune with nature, seasons and cycles as well. And I really adored the glimpses of how this family, who escaped in an ice cream van for a short time but were there for 7 years, were pulling apart tea towels to make clothes as the children grew, and really thinking about saving seeds from the first tomato sandwich and things like that so they could grow their tomatoes, and even the bush toilet composting and things like that on the day they had to move. Do you think that was important for you to really delve into and explore this sort of less commercial and more let's think about what we use life as well?
I mean, it's just something that I've been passionate about for a long time. And even when I, pick up plastic if I have a, dog plastic bag in my pocket. And I remember my dad, in the early 60s, late 50s, used to embarrass us terribly when we were old enough, because if we ever went to a picnic site, Dad would pick up all the garbage, not just ours. He just couldn't bear it. And so I think I was really, very much raised that way. And so it's something that has been in my books, I guess, for a long time. And when I wrote Nim's Island, I didn't actually think about the environmental message. It was just how I saw it. And I think for this one, again, it was the only way they were going to live. If they hadn't conserved their seeds and done everything else, well, they would have actually died. So it's just so important. I just think that we do need to think about it, all the time. And we actually kind of forgot to advertise this, but Andrea and I thought we should do like the op shop chic recycled theme for today. But
You
unfortunately, I suggested because Rumi was only 6 months when they left, he had the little baby cloth books. So they even make pockets. When they make a pocket, they make them out of that. I, being a rather messy person, although I did buy one from the op shop and I took it apart to make extra pockets, actually lost it. So I found another patch. So I've got a patch on my jeans just to, but it is good to make do. We don't, anyway, I won't go on preaching, but it is something that's really important to me because, it's a really lovely world. We can't spoil it.
Well, I thought it was really well represented in the book because lots of us in our families have, we might have a compost bin or we might sort of have a mending pile and things like that. So it was good to see it actually reflected in a young person's book so we can actually say, well, that's not that unusual. People can have this sort of a lifestyle as well. The other thing I loved, which I thought was really clever, plus you could sort of play on what you know, is Honey's mum is a book editor. And when they retreat into the valley, she has one printed manuscript from memory on her, which is a book that's going to be the next big thing. I mean, I just felt so sorry for that author. She's run away with this manuscript, never to sort of return. But then this paper becomes not just the book that mum reads to the children, but becomes their vital paper that they're writing and practicing their schoolwork on as well. Do you have a manuscript here?
I do. Funny you should ask. Actually, I nearly didn't. That wasn't what I was planning to bring. And then I thought, that would be quite fun. So this is what a manuscript looks like at the start, except Mama editor probably would have actually edited in track changes, and I didn't bring you all 15 drafts of the different track changes. But the point is that even though it's double-sided, there's white space, there's bits, and they were going to use every single bit. And so I just thought that was kind of fun. Now, you have to know, I did say when we find some of the missing messages, the publisher has said that the book, could still go ahead. It was fine from that last edit. I could not bear to have this author to be such a, casualty of the family disappearing. So that's all right. But then after that, they write on paperbark.
So this is a paperbark that you practiced on yourself to see if it would work, is that correct?
Yes, so this was actually up in Noosa, and so it's a slightly different paperbark, of course, than we have here. And I was looking at some of the bits that were on the ground, and so I collected it, and then I just, tried writing on it, and it worked fine with just a normal pen. So I very cleverly wrote paperbark on it. And and some other things which I can't read.
Shopping list.
Probably, yes, who knows. That is the problem with my writing, that's all a little mystery. But that was important to me that they had something to write on, and a lot of these things, you know, you start writing the book, and you're going along and they're doing some writing and they're doing some drawing, and you think, hang on, they've been there 7 years. They did not have 7 years supply of paper and crayons. So, you know, then you have to play with, okay, what inks are they using? And some of these things I can only touch on really quickly because, you know, it is a book for sort of 8 to 12-year-olds, 8 to 13-year-olds. It's not going to be a 600-page volume of how to make your own paint and ink, but I like the principle that kids may go on and experiment a bit.
I thought that was really well done too, even in they have school days where they sort of had to use recycled materials, and their learning wasn't more of the traditional tasks, it was sort of woven in with the day. But I also felt like a lot of us could relate to that, having homeschooled or had experiences of homeschooling in the last 2 years, how after a while we sort of gave up the books and just tried to absorb learning into what's going on in the family on a daily basis as well. One thing I wanted to touch on, well, one very important thing is the other heroes of the book, the horses. And we meet these amazing horses, Moongold and Lightning, and there's a whole sort of amazing group of horses that sort of are almost like they're the protectors of the family, as well as they're potentially the portal to sort of transition them out back into society as well. And I loved this sort of wickering and whinnying and the way they were constantly communicating with the children as well. I mean, you know, I was a horsey kid, so I love reading a horse as well. For you, were you returning to something that you love, writing about horses?
Yes, surprise, surprise. Yes, I was a horsey kid. And we got our first horse, well, to be fair, my mum got her first horse when she was 40 and I was 10-ish. And except then it sort of became the family horse, and then I had more horses after that. We actually ended up with 5 by the time I left school. And I mean, horses were just really important to me because it's such freedom when you're riding a horse. And we tended to live in places where I could ride out a long way. When we got the first horse, we lived in Colorado in the foothills of the Rockies, and it's now just part of a big city. But then, you know, there was a house on one side, and then there was nothing in the other direction, and we could just ride through kind of prairies and ravines, and it was magical. So I think but just I love, although I can't ride now since a bad car accident, I still just love imagining the feeling of riding a horse.
Well, it's certainly, there was a lot of sort of cantering scenes and heading up through the mist and all those sorts of, and, you know, kids riding bareback. I thought that was, you know, really well done. It was very nostalgic as well. Something that I thought was very lovely was the way that you addressed grief and missing family members and having people pass away in our lives as well. And at the very beginning of the book, Grandma Nan has lost her husband, Grandpa, and the family are very aware that she's locked up tight like a nut, I think. It was an amazing, you used a lovely expression. I thought that really felt like a wonderful expression of grief, and they sort of gather around her as they retreat together. And then through the next few years, you know, she's missing her husband and their grandpa as well. Was it important to you that, you know, for the last few years we've sort of missed family members, and then some of us haven't been present to say goodbye to family members as well? Was it important to you that you represented that in the book?
Yes, I mean, because that was so much part of that feeling of lockdown, and that really helpless feeling of knowing that you couldn't see people. And it was such a huge grief, I felt it had to be kind of addressed. And that was why scattered through the book, we have messages to the family that don't ever go through, or not until the very, very end. And I, identify very strongly with the family that is left behind, even though most of me was with Honey. The feeling of this family wondering what on earth has happened to our family who headed out, and to some extent that's what we felt during lockdown and can feel just whenever, divided by oceans, as you know. I'm guessing probably a third of the people here have family overseas, and we don't really know how people are going overseas, not until you see them, even when you phone. And of course that was a huge difference. They couldn't phone. When my dad died, I was ringing my mum every day for a while, and she said, really, dear, that's a bit too much. She had things to do. And, I was still ringing her every second day. And, we had, I read bedtime stories to the family that we couldn't see and, on Zoom. So we had all that. But it's still that separation, and it's part of life.
A really cool thing that happened, without giving too much of the book away, because you've got to read every page and be there for it, is Honey finds something that belongs to a long-distance relative, and that person references a time where they'd returned from war and there was a plague, or there was a pandemic virus, and there's this wonderful connection, which a lot of us were talking about this pandemic of the previous virus and then the current virus as well, and I loved how you sort of married those up too. And there was this sort of discussion about this disease that seemed to have no end. And she was reading this letter out. And during this letter, there was this process in which the family were talking about if we ever get out of here. And the letter from the relative was about that as well. I loved that this pandemic history sort of wove in and out as well, and it reminded us that a lot of the emotions we felt and that anxiety during turbulent times had been present in other times as well. I've been very reflective that we're not seeing too many books referencing the pandemic yet. We are actually seeing a few come out in the children's literature scene. Emily Gale, I think, has written one, and a couple of others. But do you think it's important that we remember and record these times in children's literature as well?
Well, very much so, because now, not to pick on you, but you can remember the lockdown, can't you? And you'll go on remembering it until you're 105. And it's important that it's recognized. It was a really significant part of our lives, but we survived it. And that's, to me, what we mustn't forget. And that's why when I worked out how old a great-great-grandfather would be, and I thought, oh my goodness, that's a perfect age. He would have lived through this previous Spanish flu. And I thought, it's so important because he did live through it. Everybody thought everybody was going to die, but they didn't. And not taking away anything from the grief of people who did die and really suffer. But when we know that we've been through something, it gives us hope to go through the next crisis, because there will always be crises. There will be other diseases. We'll have our own diseases that nobody else happens to get. But if we know that we've been through things before, then we know that there is hope. And that's why we can't forget the bad times, because we survived them. Everybody here has survived all sorts of things, and your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents survived really tough lives, but they survived long enough to have children, or you wouldn't be here. So we just can't forget that. It's so important.
And we all do already have a disease. It's called bookwormia. We're all afflicted with it, I think. Before we ask you to read, I did want to talk about something with the lovely language and the wonderful skill that you have is creating these other worlds. You often make up sort of lovely little phrases and language as well. So in the Honey in the Valley of the Horses, chickens were pock-pocks. Bonfire or fire nights, campfire nights were called the story time. Once a season they would move the ice cream van to another part of the valley and that was called moving day. And the tree where they picked the mangoes was the family tree. Do you enjoy making up these sort of, what would we call that if we had to start our own language or name things from scratch?
Well, very much so. And as I say, Honey was 4 when they moved. So, you know, in a family, we often tend to use the oldest child's funny words for some time until all of a sudden we realize, oh, wait a minute, you're 10, we shouldn't really be sending you out to the world saying these weird things. And of course, one of the youngest one who lived with us, of course, he started talking while he was there. So he would race into our bedrooms in the morning and look out. So we'd lift the blind and he'd look out and say, "Pop box," because the hen's run is just inside from there. And so I thought, that's the sort of thing that you would go on saying. There's nobody else around to say, you know, you're too old to say pop box. You need to say those other chugs, which is actually kind of a made-up word too. And so that was really important to me. And the family tree probably came from what my family called the family tree, which was an arbutus tree, which was a bit like a gum tree on my grandparents' place on Vancouver Island. So for a long time when people talked about family trees when I was a child, I thought they meant arbutus trees because every time we visited my grandparent, if we happened to live anywhere kind of anywhere vaguely west of the center of North America, we would be measured in the family tree. And I have a really, really early memory of sitting in it before I could stand. It was really significant, this tree. So I love that we do have our own little mythologies in families and our own language. And if you haven't got outsiders, you're probably going to stick to it.
I love that too. Now, before we finish, we are going to ask you to read an extract from the book because there's nothing better than hearing an author put their voice into their words while we can gather as well. So, Wendy, you're going to read a scene from this.
Okay. So this isn't the first page. This is actually page 52. So, you know, just gives you a little idea of where we've got a little way in. The mist was part of Honey's life. She saw it whenever she looked up to the top of the mountain, wreathing the peak like a necklace of beads around a neck. Now she was in it, and it was not a necklace at all. It wasn't a thin and gauzy scarf. It was a heavy blanket huddled around a cold mountain. It was as thick and fluffy as Nan-Nan's bag of wool before she'd spun and knitted it into jumpers. Honey tried to wave it away from her face, but the mist didn't move. Still Moongold cantered, steady and smooth, on towards the peak. The mist purled on Honey's face, on her hair, her arms. Ice prickled her heart. Where was Moongold taking her? And why? She'd been curious from the start, of course she had, but excited curious, wondering curious. This was terror curious, because she knew she could never get back down the mountain if the horse left her alone. The mist would trap her, and it would stop the family climbing up the mountain to find her. Moongold flicked his ears as if listening to her thoughts. He whipped a little, and Honey settled herself again on his warm, solid back. Her fingers stroked through the wiry silver mane to the softer hair of his neck. She reached further to feel the ripple of muscles in his shoulders as he cantered steadily on through the mist. "Trust me," said the twitching ears. "Trust me," said the harumphing whicker. "Trust me," said the rippling golden back and shoulders. So Honey did. She closed her eyes and relaxed into the rhythm of his gait till she was nothing but movement and feeling. Her skin welcomed the cool touch of the mist. She breathed in the cold rock smell of the mountains and the sharp scent of a trampled herb. She heard the far-off caw of a raven. She was part of the enchanted horse, and she was all of herself. She was complete, which meant she couldn't possibly be afraid any longer. Moongold slowed, and Honey opened her eyes. They were on the top of the mountain. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for sharing a scene of what is going to be a read that I know you'll all enjoy. And we now, I guess, congratulate you on launching Honey in the Valley of the Horses. And thank you, Wendy, for sharing this, another of your wonderful writing skills and stories with us, which is really a story of resilience, resourcefulness, trust, as well as courage as well. Congratulations is another wonderful book, and we're so pleased to celebrate you today.
Yes, and all right. So we can have a few questions. That's why I didn't want to read too long. Oh, did you want to ask questions? No, that's okay. You don't have to. Well, if nobody's going to ask some questions, we will mention. We do have some thank yous too, and we also have. Don't worry, Sonny, you don't have to take all the flowers. We have some refreshments. So we have some witchetty grubs, and if you don't recognize them, they are labeled, so you might actually recognize witchetty grubs. And we have some fresh creek water, and some apples from the mysterious trees, because of course apple trees shouldn't actually be growing in a Queensland rainforest, but there are some apple trees, and so that one I actually referenced by having apples, and the bush tucker berries are also there, but you're fairly safe with them. But we, and there's a couple of mysterious things which come from the outside world, but there's also a few beautiful little cupcakes, and those reference the gift of love from family and outside, and I cannot spot the cupcake maker who is hiding somewhere, but she's behind. Because that's so much part of the book, that our family, no matter where they are, they love us, and that's all part of our lives. So, and also you can always ask me a question if you want to come up when we're signing.
Great. What we're going to do now as well is the crafts to do afterwards, and there I believe Jane has some beautiful images of horses that you might even want to take one home and do some colouring. And is that the only craft? Is that right?
No, sorry. So Nalini has spent an awful lot of effort into preparing bookmarks for people to put together, if anybody would like to do that. And I believe we're going to do that, Jane, in the little room downstairs. There's you call it the blue room, which sounds very beautiful and mysterious, but I believe it has a table and handy things if you're trying to make bookmarks.
Terrific. So, great. So, and then of course Jane's selling the books, and Wendy will be over there signing them as well. So once again, Wendy, thank you very much for sharing your book today, and we really hope everyone enjoys reading it as well. Well done, please congratulate me.
Thank you. But since I have this big bunch of flowers here, I don't believe my husband got them for me.
Shame on you, Tom.
So, and I have cards for you, they're lost in my bag. I'll get your cards later. So, I don't know how we're going to reach you, Jane, but there are...
Crowd surfing.
So, thank you for such a beautiful job. Andrea does such magnificent preparation of everything she does. She is just such a lesson. She may not have been writing as long as I have, but I have so much to learn from her about organisation and many, many, many things. So thank you so much. Jane just does so much for the world of books here. And there are two more people. I'll just shout now. Oops, sorry. Nalini has put in so much work for these bookmarks and her general enthusiasm and her podcasts on books, and Sophie has contributed, lots of joy. But also Michelle, who made the cupcakes. Michelle launched a book for me several years ago, and she snuck away while I was about to take her out to lunch. And so you have to be thanked now.
This has been a Dark Magazine podcast, and I'm your host, Nalini Haynes. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and have fun.